Kumlein and a Black Gemara. We are up to Daf Ayin Amar Aleph Yevamos. We're finishing the Perek Almanul Kohen Gadol. We're up to about 10 lines at the top of the page. The Mishnah says that an Eved disqualifies a woman. So if an Eved has even a one-time relationship with a woman, she could no longer marry a Kohen, and nor can she eat Truma. If she was a Bas Kohen, she can no longer eat Truma. And also we said that the child does not, if the child is an Eved, it does not pass. And we want to know how in the world can a woman have a child, an Eved Kanani. To explain the case in the Mishnah, where the woman was married, she was, let's say, a Bas Kohen, married to Yisrael, had a child, and then this child had a son, and this son fell madly in love with this Shivcha, and he basically turned himself into an Eved Ivri, so that he should be able to marry the Shivcha, and then they had a son, and it was her grandson or granddaughter. And we say that the grandson or granddaughter is not considered her grandson or granddaughter, because when it comes to a maid, all the children go after the maid, after the mother, and therefore she has no child. So if her husband, if she was a Bas Kohen married to Yisrael, she can now resume, and her son died, so now she can resume eating again, and the grandson doesn't count. If she was a Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen, and so the grandson doesn't help her at all, because it's not her grandson, it's a Shivcha's son. If she was a Bas Kohen married to Yisrael, says if he doesn't exist, so she goes back and starts eating Truma. Says, how do you know you look at a grandchild? My time, and what's the reason? Amakras and the Pasuk Isha v'Yoladet here. The reason, first of all, is because the children go after the mother, not after the father, when it comes to a Shimcha. Mamzer, then the Mishnah said, a Mamzer, Posel, Umaychel. That a mamzer disqualify, Posel and Michael. Mamzer is considered her child, like any other child, no different than mamzer or any other child. How do we know that? How do you know a mamzer? You might think that because the mamzer is born illegally, shouldn't in any way help her to say, oh, well, she's married to a kohen, and now the only surviving members are grandson have to be a mamzer. Maybe we shouldn't count that as anything. We say, no, we count it. How do we know? Because as a pasuk, when can she go back home? Let's say she was a Bas Kohen. When can she go back home? Only with Zed Ein Lo, she has no children. So we dash Ein Lo Elo Zara. All we know is if she had children, Zed Zara and no grandchildren. Tamalim says Zed Ein Lo. She has no children down the line. We come up in any case. Ein Lo Zed kosher. So all we know is she doesn't have any kosher children. That apostle Menayin, how do you know that if she has a mamzer, it prevents her from going back to her family? So we there's like an extra yud. Is ayin Allah. Look into it. Look into it to see if there's any children. I don't care if it's a mamzer, that means that's so revealed. As long as there's a child from him, it counts as if there's children or grandchildren. So the Gemara Zara, we just said we use these very pasuk with Zera Einlo to say that they're grandchildren. Zera for that you don't need a pasuk. You don't need. Why not? Because b'nei bani marei bani. We have a general rule that grandchildren are just like children, so we don't need any special pasuk to teach your grandchildren. So what do we do with the pasuk? Zera Einlo to tell you is that even a mamzer is considered a child. Says the Gemara, Ki eats a crow, is that a apostle? So what do we need a apostle for? If it's a child and mamzer. It seems that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva, because our Mishnah says that if a goy has a relation with a Yiddish woman and have a child, the child's a mamzer. Now, why would the child be a mamzer? Because it's an isalav for to marry a goy. So it sounds like it follows Rabbi Akiva that says that mamzer can be produced from an isalav, but we hold that a mamzer can only produce from an isakaris. So goy, an Yiddish woman, the child is not a mamzer. So it followed that it goes according to Akiva. The Amr says yesh mamzer chayav alav. So the Gemara thinks that the argument of whether if a father is a goy, the child is a mamzer or not, hinges on the argument of whether a mamzer can be produced chayav alav. Says you want to know. In fact, the two arguments are totally unrelated. I feel tamer rabbanon. Even if you want to follow Rabbanon who says that a mamzer is only for chayav increases, but nevertheless, when it comes to a goy with the Eid, the child is a mamzer. But they hold for goy or an eved, even though that it's only a chayav alav, the child is a mamzer. The chiyasa dima like this of dima sheravenu. The child is a mamzer. I told you yesterday there's a big machlekes in halacha who the halacha is like, and we it's a very interesting. Or the halacha is that the child is kosher. Very interesting. Yevamos Daf who wants to say that the only time we say that something along the lines The Chabad Das writes that you have the father who's 50% a goy, the mother 50% a yid, and then you have Teda Mitzvah, which is like the other 50%. In other words, there are three partners in a person. So he wants in Mechadish that if the child grows up following Torah and mitzvahs, so then majority are yid and the child's a yid. If the child is brought up as a goy, he wants to argue that the child is a goy, because then the majority of the child's influences, father and his way of life, is not like a yid. Then it said here, Kohen Gadol should probably place. If you remember the case we had here, the Kohen Gadol was the grandson. She was married to a Yisrael, then had a daughter who married a Kohen, and had a son who became the Kohen Gadol. As a result of this Kohen Gadol, his mother can continue eating truma if his father died because she married a Kohen and she has a son. But the grandmother cannot eat truma because the grandmother now has a grandson from her husband, the Yisrael. So it's as if, even though she's a Bas Kohen, she cannot eat. And she was very unhappy about that. Truma is plentiful and available and it's very cheap. So the Gemara told her, Hareni Kapara ben Biti Kuza. She goes around saying that I am a kuza is a small little jug and a kada is a big barrel. So she says that all the trouble that I had should be a kapara on my let's say I have a grandson, a mamza, but this grandson mamza, let's say I'm married to a kohen, entitles me that I can go ahead and eat truma. So this little kuza is worth a lot. So Hareni Kapara ben Biti Kuza, even though she did something wrong, she committed adultery, had a child in mamza, I should be kapara for her because her son, the kuza, the little jug, helps me out that I can go ahead and eat truma because on account of my husband who's a kohen. But machlem truma enabled me to truma. But the eni kapara ben Biti Kata, even though my grandson is a kohen gadol, my daughter is a kad, she has such a yichus. She has such an unbelievable nachas that she has a son, a kohen gadol, and yet he ruined my life. She posal him in a truma. Because of him, if I'm married to a Yisrael, and I'm a Bas Kohen, I cannot presume to eat truma. Interesting saying. Hadin Allah, what exactly the point of that saying is, I'm not sure. Hadin Allah almana. So nothing is perfect. There are always side effects. Says the Gemara, a new pedic called pedic odel. Odel is someone who is not circumcised. So it says here that an odel and chalatmim, anybody who is tamei, la yechle b'truma, not permitted to eat truma. They themselves cannot eat truma on account of the fact they're not circumcised. But nesheyin, they avdein, but their wives and their servants who don't have that issue is the fact is that their husbands are still kohenim, so therefore yechle truma, they're entitled to eat truma. Now there's big machlekes showing me what this odel is. Rashi here and the long cases here both agree that odel is, even if it's, let's say, that it's a family of hemophiliac, two of the brothers died on the table, and halacha says you're not allowed to get circumcised. The fact is he's an odel, he cannot eat truma. However, the Rabbeinu Tam says, all over Shas, he disagrees. He says that an odel, that's not an odel. He says that's like somebody right before they're circumcised, before the due date. It's not, this is, since it's an oinus, he does not disqualify from eating truma. Odel means somebody who doesn't want to mala deliberately because they're scared of the excessive pain or they saw how much pain it was. No, halachically, they should have malad themselves. And therefore, but they just didn't because they're too scared. That's what we mean by saying odel disqualify from eating truma. But if someone halacha says, don't mala yourself because you account your brother's dying by a bris, doesn't count. Anyway. What about up to Daka Khrushchevka? What about these two people that are disqualified because they cannot procreate? Either that one of the testicles are crushed or because Khrushchevka that is partly cut, the actual member, Hein v'avdeyin yechlu, they can eat, and their avodim can eat. But Neshein la yechlu, the wives, because since the P'tur Daka is not allowed to marry a Yiddish woman, so they shouldn't come into the Kalor or Khrushchevka. Therefore, according to Rashi, she became a chalala. She became a halala, and therefore she cannot eat. Other Rishonim disagree. They say that a halala can only be made if it's specifically usher to a kohen. A kohen is not married a divorcee. So if he marries a divorcee, she becomes a halala. But this law of a Khrushchevka and a P'tur Daka is nothing to do with the kohen. It's doing Klal Yisrael. And the Klal Yisrael, nobody's allowed to marry. In Klal Yisrael, you're not allowed to marry a P'tur Daka, Khrushchevka, because they cannot procreate. It's not a halala, but rather they want to argue she maybe comes under the banner of a zoina. Because since she cannot have children, all the relations she has with this person is like znus. What happened in Layada? She married the guy who was healthy, and after they got married and everything else, a while later he became one of these two afflictions, P'tur Daka, Khrushchevka, and they had no relation since, and nothing happened wrong. Then they had no relations afterwards. And even the wife can eat. They can eat. because she didn't do any yisr there. She didn't come a halala. These of tzedakah, what's the tzedakah called? Shnif Tzruabim Shloy, that it was crushed as testicle, even one. But Filachas, maybe one of them. Krushovcha kosher nichlas hagid, the male member get ripped. V'imnish tayim atorah. If from the crown is hanging, I feel him before the side, even just one here, kosher, it is kosher. Says the Gemara, time we learned. How do you know the oral cannot eat truma? How do you know cannot eat truma? Because it says in possibly the words toishav v'socher by a pesach. It says by Korban Pesach that a toishav and a socher should not participate. What do you call it? Should not eat. It says toishav v'socher with truma. It says toishav v'socher by truma. It says that the toishav of a kohen and the socher of a kohen should not eat kodesh, and kodesh means actually truma. Is what do you mean when it says toishav v'socher by Pesach they shouldn't eat? What are we talking about? We're talking about oral. Sorry, just like Toisha Pesach by Pesach, there's a din by Korban Pesach as well, another din, which is that an odol cannot eat from it. So after odol also, so make it a Shabbat, Toisha Pesach by Truma, that says that Toisha should not eat, and we find by Korban Pesach that an odol is not allowed to eat, and said that the Toisha Pesach there as well, so therefore we say that it's like an odol, that an odol cannot eat by Korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Kiva says, and so you don't even need to say Shabbat, how do you argue, but it says the pasuk, ish. Says twice the word ish. If a member of Aaron he happens to have a moment, so on and so forth, they should not eat until if they're tummy, they should not eat until they're tired, and so on. So it says ish lerabes. Who's the second ish? Lerabes oral. When it says the person should eat, including oral, should not eat from truma. Let's analyze. Rabbi Lezer says, just like on oral is forbidden. So too, after truma, so where it says the word toishav sacha by truma, it means an odol should not eat from it. So the Gemara mufta, you must say. Remember, gzeir shava. You can have three possible gzeir shavas. One is that there's nothing extra here, but it's such a conclusive gzeir shava because there's no questions to be asked. One is if it's mufta mitzadecha that on one of the two psukim it's extra, then you can ask a question. It has to be a really strong question, or we'll soon see some say any question. And then you have mufta mishnei dadim. It has to be totally extra on both sides. Then you can't ask any questions because you say, why did the Torah put these words there? They're totally superfluous. The teacher just did. Says the Gemara, you must conclude that mufna it is extra kadila mufna, because if it's not extra, you can ask a straight question. No, why by Pesach odol forbidden? There's so many rules and strictures by Pesach. For example, if you have the wrong thoughts in mind when you shecht it, or there's leftovers, or if somebody's tummy not participate. So therefore, there's so machmer on odol also cannot participate. When it comes to truma, you don't have these dinim of pigul and noisa. So therefore, it doesn't apply. So you got to lie. You're right. Afli move it's extra. So you got a high movement. So which word is extra? The toisha v'sacha by Pesach, by truma, by both. Either truma it can be because we actually need it. At the time we learned what does it mean toisha v'sacha by truma they should need. We're not talking about an odol. Who are we talking about here? The time we learned toisha is a konoi kinyan olam. Toisha is somebody who's a permanent a slave. Let's say a Jewish slave, an Ebedimini who decided to stay beyond the 6 years and have his ear pierced. And Schir is a Kanu Kinyan Shanim. And Sachir is somebody who's there only for 6 years until his time expires. So therefore, an Eved Ivri cannot eat Truma. Eved Kanani can because you own it, but an Eved Ivri cannot eat Truma. So we need the Toishav and the Sachir to teach you about these two Gavani Kanani. Eved Ivri cannot eat Truma. Now, the obvious question is, if you tell me that even if he stays up to 50 years, up to Yevil, he cannot eat Truma, you need to tell me that if he's there only for 6 years, he cannot eat Truma. What do you need for? The Yemet Taisha or Yemet Sacher just tells Taisha and not tell Sacher. But I would say, if a guy who's staying there up to Yevil cannot eat Truma, surely if he's only there for Shemitah, they're only there for 6 years, he cannot eat Truma. Moshe says, you're right. However, if we only say one word, I would always try to eat that. Whenever you have to make a chiddush, you always learn only the minimum chiddush. So if I only had one word there, what kind of Eved Ivri would I ascribe it to? I would say he's talking about a 6-year Eved Ivri, not a 50-year Eved Ivri. I would say a 50-year Eved Ivri, that's permanent. In fact, the word of the Torah for 50 years is lo olam, like permanent. Ilu Kain, if only be one, he's going to say Tosha is a konik kinyan shanim only years. I will konik kinyan olam oichel. But if you kinyan olam, I would say go ahead. Therefore, you need both. Once you have both, and I automatically know that one of them is for 6 years, one of them is for longer term, and the word Toshiv obviously signifies longer term. Limit al Toshiv, so which one is extra? On the Pesach, Mufni. Pesach is extra. So you don't need it. Hi Toshiv is Sacher the Kosrach Mon Pesach and my Niyu. So why does it say two words, Toshiv and Sacher? What exactly is it referring to? So if you look at it, what does it mean? You think he's trying to tell me that an Eved Ivri does not have to eat a Korban Pesach? Let's assume that Toshiv Sacher by Truma means the same thing it means by Pesach. Something extra you need to teach you that what? That an Eved Ivri does not Pesach. An Eved Ivri is a full-fledged Yid. He has all the mitzvahs. Why shouldn't he eat Korban Pesach? If to live at Pesach, what kind when we have a rule? We just said by Truma that he doesn't eat. Why doesn't he eat? Because it doesn't belong to his master. He's a Yid in his own right. No, if he's in his own right, so saying about Korban Pesach, surely he's chayiv in Pesach. So what does it mean when it says by Korban Pesach that a Toshiv and Sacher doesn't eat? His master is not kohenim. We having more kedushin in the Rishonim ask that it says by Eved Ivri Gufay Konola, the Eved Ivri belongs to the master. That's only referring to when you want to release him, you have to give him a bill of divorce, but not that you actually own the person. When it comes to mitzvahs and everything else, the Eved Ivri is totally independent, is chayiv in all the mitzvahs. So how come an Eved Ivri is allowed to marry a Shifcha Kananis? I mean, a Yid is not allowed to marry a Shifcha Kananis. An Eved Ivri can. If he's a full-fledged Yid, how can he marry a Shifcha Kananis? There we have a special pasuk where it says that he sort of works double. That means he works by day and by night. How does he work by night for his master? He's sleeping. It must be that he has a Shifcha and he's procreating. Says the Gemara. Now, that's a very interesting question. Your Gemara is saying that Eved Ivri is chayiv, but why is he chayiv? Because he's independent from the master. But let's say he's not independent from the master. Eved Kanani, for example, is not independent. Eved Kanani also has to eat Korban Pesach. So what's the difference, independent or dependent? So the difference is if it's dependent on the master, it's the master who chooses which Korban he's part of. He nominates him. If he's independent from the master, he chooses himself. So the Gemara, it's obviously what that why does it say Toshiv Sacher by Korban Pesach? Extra to teach you this is a Shava. Now what? That just like about Korban Pesach and Odol says the Torah says clearly an Odol cannot eat, so here also cannot eat. Says the Gemara, Bakati Mufne Mitzad Echru. Says the Gemara, it's only extra on one side. And what's the problem with that? Rabbi Loza himself is of the opinion, the Ammar, he says, Mufne Mitzad Echad Lemedin Umeshivin. He says there's only extra on one side. It's a valid Shava, but you have a right to ask questions. I have a very strong question. Maybe by Korban Pesach we are stricter because of those pigul and noiser and tummy, therefore an Odol cannot eat from it. But when it comes to Truma, we don't have these strictures. Maybe Taka, Adol could eat from it. Question, still a valid question. No, move the made the Meshivin. Says the Gemara, no. Since you have two words here, Toshiv and Sacher, and they're both extra, we're going to do something very, very interesting. We're going to take one of those words and roll it over to Truma, and now we're going to say it's as if we have an extra word by Truma and an extra word by Korban Pesach, because we have two words, Toshiv and Sacher. So keeping the Gufi Latzadik, we don't need either word, Toshiv or Sacher by Korban Pesach. Shadi Chad Alamed, the Shadi Chad Amalamed. We leave one on the Malamed, which is Korban Pesach, the one that's teaching us. It says that oral is cannot he participate, and we take the other word and put it on the Lamed. That's what we're trying to learn out with. You learn to learn with, and that is that also an oral is not, it cannot be involved. Okay, and not in Truma. So if you're already comparing laws to Korban Pesach, so the other laws about Korban Pesach, let's carry them over to Truma. I know which laws to carry over. You decided that we're going to take the law of Oral, which applies to Pesach shouldn't eat, and move them over to Truma. But there's another law, for example, by Pesach. For example, like Korban Pesach, an oinen is not permitted to eat a Korban Pesach, right? If somebody's a close relative passed away, they cannot eat a Korban Pesach. We learned already before. When it comes to Truma, it says Zorus that an oinen could eat. Why? Let's learn from Korban Pesach. They can't. So Ima Pesach oinen asaboy. Since by Pesach oinen is forbidden, so let's also say after Truma also oinen should be forbidden. We have a special pasuk. It says v'chol zor, that a zor, a stranger, should not eat from it. It's as if to say only a stranger should not eat from it, but somebody else could. Who's that somebody else? An oinen. So we're going to use v'chol zor to include an oinen could eat, and we're going to use the Gzer Shavah Korban Pesach to exclude an oral. And now the Gemara want to know, how do you know which one to exclude and which ones to include? Says the Gemara, it said the Chazar, Zor is a mark, only but there's an Easter of Zor is the fact that he doesn't belong to Aninas, but not Anoinin. Says the Gemara, Ema, why don't we say say, let's exclude Arelis. We have a Gzer Shavah. So we have a Gzer Shavah to include, but the Gzer Shavah doesn't spell out what, and we have a miyat, an exclusion, and doesn't spell out what. And we decided, you know what, we're going to deem the others a terrible thing, should not to eat from the truma, but oinen could. How do you know which way to include, what to exclude? So it makes most sense that Arela should be included in the exclusion. Why? She came because Arela and Odel, if you have to exclude something, which is worse, an Odel or an Ein? I say Odel is far worse. Why? Because first of all, Mechusa Maisa, he has to do an activity to get rid of that. He has to physically, it's not a question of time, he has to go mal himself, number one. Number two, Maisa Gufa, this activity has to take place on his body, he has to go through a change. And number three, if honors cutters, and you don't get cutter every day, you don't you don't circumcise yourself, you chayv kares, or if you die without meal, you chayv kares, depending on the Rambam and the Ravid. The yeshel is nedibus, a mitzvah that's given to us before Matan Torah. And further than that, umilas schara b'avodim hakebes. Mila is that strong that even if you're circumcised, if your son is not circumcised, or your slave is not circumcised, you cannot eat Pesach. 5 chumras. So therefore, we decide, who can't eat from the carbon, who cannot eat from the truma? We're going to say it's the oral. Says the Gemara, Aninas have a leila buyu. No, Aninas also has chumras. She can yeshna b'chosha. Even if you had by mila, once you fix it up, it's over. It's fixed up. Aninas, you can one day if somebody's father can pass away, another his mother pass away. It happens all the time. It can continue onwards. Number one. Number two, when a heg is ba'an noshim, it applies to men and women. Number two, and number three, we have no control over it. You can't fix it. You can't remedy it. They pass away. They pass away. So when I say right, but hanach nefishim. There are 3 strictures there, but there are 5 chumras, stringencies that you have by oral. So that's why if we have to exclude one thing from truma, we're going to say it's oral. Rabba comes along and says, "But hanach nefishim. I don't need that svara because this is 5, that's 3. It's not the reason why." Now, even without that, you can't say. You know why? Because Shavkinen, because by Korban Pesach, it says clearly an oral should not eat from the Korban Pesach. By nowhere does it say by Pesach that an oinen should not eat from Pesach. You know how we know that by a Pesach an oinen shouldn't eat? Because we compare it to Maisa Sheni. And by Maisa Sheni, Pasha Kisov, it says, I didn't eat it while I was an oini. I didn't do any of it while I was an oini. So therefore, we learn out the same thing by Korban Pesach. So if I have a choice, Gzeri Shabbos, to learn from Pesach, something which is overtly in written by Korban Pesach, or something which is merely an inference, of course you should learn what's written clearly. Shavkinan Arela is the ksib the goof of the Pesach. You want to leave behind Arela, which is written clearly by Pesach. And the Alfinan, and you want to learn that Aninas of Pesach, you want to learn Aninas from Pesach, the Pesach goof of the Pesach. The Pesach itself is not written anywhere else. It's only, we learn it out from Ma'aseh. So therefore, we can't, we have no choice. We have to learn Arelas from Pesach, not, what do you call it? And not Aninas, because it's not written there. Says the Gemara, okay, that's another question. There's another din by Pesach. So let's say that just like this disqualifies you from eating Pesach, it should also disqualify you eating Truma. What is that? Imad Pesach, what do we find by Pesach? Milaz if your child did not get circumcised, or if your slave did not get circumcised, you cannot eat from the Korban Pesach. So if we find by Pesach that Milah of the Scharav Ma'akeves prevents you from Pesach, so after Truma, by Truma also, let's say Milah's Scharav Ma'akeves, and the Milah of your son or your Evet should hold back. On Makro, it says in the pasuk, "Umalta oisai," you should circumcise your child. Oz yoichal boy. Then you can eat from it. When we boy it, we're talking about the Korban Pesach. What does the word boy come to teach you? To teach you only about Korban Pesach is this an issue. Milah zechalav avodim hakebes boy melechel Pesach. It's only an issue when it comes to Korban Pesach. However, the ain't milah zechalav avodim hakebes truma. Not when it comes to other things. For example, truma. From the word boy, we know that it only is an issue when it comes to Korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, if so, let's look at the pasuk by oral. If so, that's your logic. By oral, how do you know by Korban Pesach he cannot eat an oral? Somebody's uncircumcised cannot eat because it says call oral yechol boy. Same word boy. So why don't you make the same drasha? Boy ain't no eichel. That only boy you cannot eat. But an oral could eat true. So you can't say that because we have a Gzeri Shavah. We have a Gzeri Shavah Toisha tells you that what we should compare to Pesach. So therefore, just like by Pesach and Oral cannot eat, so too by Truma. Now, the problem is in the Gzeri Shavah, it doesn't tell us what to include, what to exclude. So you must ask a question: how do you know to say the Gzeri Shavah comes to teach you on Oral that an Oral, just like Pesach, cannot eat, so too by Truma? And therefore, we'll use boy to tell you that this is limited only to Pesach and but Truma. Somebody's Eved is not circumcised, doesn't matter. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the meal of Avodah Zarah is very important. And that holds you back with Truma as well if your servants aren't your mallet or your child. But when it comes to Arelis, it says, boy, only by Pesach it's an issue, not by Truma. So why do you deem this way? Mistabra, it makes sense. Arelis, the gufe, have a lelerebuye. It makes sense. Your own Arelis. You should say that what if it's forbidden by Pesach, it's forbidden by Truma. She came massive gufe because for a few reasons. First of all, it's on your own body. Not like over there, that's on the body of your son or the body of your slave. So it's on your own body, number one. That's still quite stricter. And va'anush chorus, plus you get chorus if you don't what do you call it? If you don't mala yourself, you're going to get chorus. You don't get chorus if your son didn't mala or your evid. You don't get chorus for them. So only get chorus if you didn't mala. So you have these two chumras, and that's why arelas are so strict. True, mostly cannot no, maybe I can argue for carrot. Milas as a chora of avodav havledabu. You should have actually say that no, the mila of your son and your evid is even greater than an oral. Sheken yeshna b'chol. First of all, that the mila of your, when the mila of your an oral is a one-off. Once you fix it, fix it. Hashenken, you always have new slaves, you have new children. They'll always need a mila, so it's an ongoing thing. Number one. So we answer you right, but Hanach Lefishin, the two chumras here versus one chumra there. Ibaizim will give another answer. A simple reason why, if it's a choice of oral or the mila of avodav, we can say oral is one that you cannot be true. Very simply. But forget about the fact that this is two, this is one. Mi'ika media doesn't make sense. The areil is the goof. What you want is that I am not circumcised. I'm an oral. I should still be able to eat truma. But if my son is not gemalat, I should not be able to eat truma. Which shulchay do you think is more important, my own mila or my son? Even though it's a mitzvah to both. Of course, I take precedent. So mi'ika media the areil is the goof. My own personal areil is you want to say oral, go ahead and eat truma because it says boy. But the areil is of others, like my slaves or my son, that should hold me back. Doesn't make sense. Says the Gemara, okay, so now you tell me whenever it says boy, it's coming to limit, and it only applies here and not somewhere else. So the few other boys, let's see what's it coming to tell us. Here it applied, but not somewhere else. Where's the not somewhere else? So tell me, I'll ask you a simple question. It says in the pasuk, it says kol oru lo yechol boy. It says kol benecha lo yechol boy. Lomali. It says kol ben necher, that's somebody who is a stranger, totally a stranger. And it means a goy. Right now we're learning. Lo yechol boy should not eat the current Pesach. And what should he eat? Lomali, what does the boy come tell you? So we say ben necher doesn't only mean a goy. A ben necher actually can mean a yid who shmatzich. So he says who became a proselyte. Lomali converted to some other religion. Boy, Hamoras das Peselis. Only when it comes to Pesach, that if he behaved like a necher, strange to Hashem, then we say that he's disqualified even from eating Korban Pesach. The Ein Hamoras das Peselis by other things, by Meiser. Hamoras das does not disqualify you, let's say, from giving Meiser or all the other mitzvahs. Big Machek is training what exactly the definition of Ben Necher is Hamoras das. Does it mean, like Rashi learns, that he completely turns away from Hashem, he becomes an Ovid Avodah Zarah? Others learn he doesn't do any of the mitzvahs. He's a mummer to kol Torah kula. Doesn't have to come avodah zarah. Even if he does not worship avodah zarah, if he's a mummer to kol Torah kula, he doesn't do any of the avodah. Doesn't do any of the mitzvahs of the Torah. He's called a ben necher. And others say that if he's a mummer to davar echad, even to one avodah, if he deliberately, spitefully doesn't do that particular mitzvah, he's disqualified from being Korban Pesach. Says the okay. It says in the pasuk kol oral lo yochel boy by Korban Pesach. It says that we call oral lo yochel boy. Lomali, what do you have to have that boy for? What's it coming to exclude? More answers. Boy eino oichel. He doesn't eat a Korban Pesach. Aval oichel hu b'matzah mor. The rest of the Korban Pesach he does. Because you would have thought it says al matzah zamarem yechlu. The Korban Pesach is attached to the matzah mora. You would think if he's disqualified Korban Pesach, he should be disqualified also the matzah mora. He says no. The itzich lemichtav oral, the itzich lemichtav kol ben necher. You need both oral and you need ben necher to tell you that only here. Because I'm on oral. If only say oral mishum demayis. I would say, why an oral is disqualified for Korban Pesach? Because it's me. He's not circumcised or anything else. Abba ben necher, a person who's a ben necher who might be circumcised, just and so on. The loymos, there's nothing miyas there. Just he's a bad person, but he's not miyas. Maybe he's not disqualified for Korban Pesach. Nothing honest person. Because I'm going to call ben necher. He has no interest in Hashem. Aval oral the libo l'shemayim, but oral that he does, he is a from a yid, but he's an oral. If we need it. This is what Rashi's proof and Tesis and other Rishonim that an odel means that halacha says he shouldn't, because it says in Liba L'Shamayim. He means well, but he can't circumcise. Rabbeinu Tam says no. I told you before that's called an oinus. He's like a person who didn't yet reach the time to be malad, and that's not called an emo. But rather, because he's doing it out of fear of the terrible tsar, he's still Liba L'Shamayim, not like somebody who is spiteful or anything else. He's just scared. Therefore, we can call him Liba L'Shamayim. Okay, we'll stop here and continue tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.